Alright, so I wanted to make a tutorial and I asked around, and it seems like the tutorial most people want me to make is on line art. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just explain some sort of technical stuff when it comes to Photoshop and sort of setup for drawing line art on top of a sketch. And then I'm gonna go into like the three different methods you have at your disposal for drawing line art. And then finally, I'll go into some do's and don'ts when it comes to like specifically what to do when it comes to line art. So for this video, I'm just gonna use this sketch I drew back in 2017 to sort of explain some stuff. Tip number one when it comes to like the technical aspects. You want to make sure to work with an image file with a high resolution. So just like go into your settings and make sure that the file is maybe like 3000 pixels high or something. That's the size I usually work with. If you have kind of a slower computer, then you might want to scale it down. And I also know like some artists just keep it at a really low resolution anyways, and that's just how they work. But if you want to make like really crisp, clean, sharp lines, then you might want to scale up your picture a bit. The second tip is to make sure that your sketch layer is on very low opacity. I like to have it at an opacity where I can like barely even see the sketch. Right now it's at 5%, no, it's at 7%. But the thing is, like, if your sketch is too high, then obviously you can't really tell what the line looks like before you remove the sketch, and then everything's gonna be like this surprise. Like, you remove the sketch and it's like, oh, I wonder what it looks like. That's not what we want. We want to be able to tell all the time how the finished drawing is coming along. And also, you want to kind of remove the sketch every once in a while, just to see how everything is coming along. Number 3 is kind of counterintuitive, but sometimes it can be nice to work with a brush with a bit of texture on it, and not just work with a straight digital line. It can actually help your line art look cleaner. So I usually just draw with this brush. It's the basic hard round brush. I don't know why it's this one and not this one. I just feel more comfortable with this one, I guess. And you can go into your setting and kind of add some texture to it. I guess the point of this is just to make sure you don't scrutinize like every single tiny detail on the thing. Like if I'm working with a really wobbly texture line, then it's gonna be harder to tell where kind of the irregularities are. And that's gonna give the impression that your line work is actually a bit cleaner. But you don't want to overdo this. This right here, that's overdoing it. You want it to just like obscure the brush a tiny bit, but not to the point where you can actually see it in the final drawing. The final tip for sort of the technical side of things is to open up a second window. I really like doing this. It kind of depends on what you're drawing on, but you just go into like window, I don't know what this says, but it's the top thing, and then new window for drawing, and there you go. The reason why you do this is because you kind of want to have an idea of the full picture all the time, because when you're all zoomed in like I am now, it can be kind of easy to lose control of the final product. And especially because when I'm zoomed in now, even though I'm working with a high DPI, that is amount of pixels, the lines are kind of still pixely and unclear, and that makes it even harder to tell like what the entirety of the picture looks like. And you also want to see like, say this is more finished than what it actually is now. You want to see like, does this line match with the line quality over here? You don't want like your lines to be all different. So I guess that's it for the kind of more technical aspects, and now I'll move into kind of the different methods you have at your disposal for drawing the actual line art. So there's kind of like 3 methods for drawing the line art, and you're probably already using all of them. And I use all of them in every single drawing, but they each have like their own advantages and disadvantages and like pitfalls you can fall into. So it's kind of important to be aware of which ones they are. So the first one which is probably like the one you go to first, is kind of like slowly building up your line like this, just sort of like moving along, sort of like slowly building up your line. And the advantage with this is you have a lot of control of where the line goes, so it doesn't require like a lot of aiming. You just have to make sure that the line follows itself, that you're not like missing the point where you last left off. But the problem with it is that you get like these little inconsistencies in the texture of the line, and you can fix those, but most likely there are gonna be so many of them that you're not gonna go back in and like fix every single part of the line. And you might also fall into the trap of becoming too careful with your lines. Like, because I spent so long like kind of scrutinizing this line, there's an issue I see with this line right now, and that is that it's too thin in comparison to the rest of the drawing. But I'm gonna kind of be scared to move back over it, because I've kind of like, it's like dear to my heart and I don't want to mess it up. And like going over it again is gonna mess it up. It might mess it up for the better, but it's gonna change the like nature of the line. So yeah, the second method is kind of making these swooping lines, and this is the one that probably takes the most practice, because you have to work on your accuracy, and you're just gonna have to like train your hand at hitting the right place. But the major advantage of this is that it looks super clean when you get it right, and it's gonna train up your accuracy and your control of your hand a lot faster than doing the other method. Like, when this comes naturally to you, you kind of have the world in your hands or something. But the pitfall with this one is that you might end up being too hasty, because sort of the point of drawing with this method is to be quick and make fast choices, kind of. You might fall into the trap of like being too quick. So what you don't want to do is just like plop down a line a few times, and then you think, oh, that was good enough, I guess, and then you put down another line and it's like, oh, that was so energetic and nice, and then you put down another line and another, and you kind of just do this to make everything because you know, you've seen a video that says, oh, I gotta draw fast, so that's what's gonna make my lines clean. But like, obviously this leg is way messed up. The lines aren't coming together very well, even though like each individual line is all clean and nice. Just don't be too hasty, take your time and make sure that every single line you put down actually describes the shape you want it to describe, and just use Ctrl-Alt-Delete a lot until you finally get the line that you actually want to use. And like, at some point obviously you have to decide like, this line was good enough, but you want to take a bit more time before you make that choice. And also, even though you have like the perfect line, don't be afraid to just like delete the entire thing and do it over again, because you gotta work up the confidence to make the decision that this line wasn't good enough and then delete it and replace it with a different line, because otherwise you're just gonna accept a bunch of bad lines, and that's not good. So obviously for digital you have the Ctrl-Alt-Delete tool, which is very nice and good to have. But in real life, if you're drawing with a pencil or something, you still want to practice drawing clean. What you do then is just you take your pencil and you kind of hover above where you want to place the line. I guess I can show it on the sketch. Like, you kind of just like practice without actually putting the line down, and then you're just gonna have to make a commitment at some point. But make sure like to be careful before you actually place the line down, because especially if you're drawing with like a pen, that's where the line is gonna be. And if you mess up, the only thing you can do is just like keep drawing on the same line until it looks acceptable. Finally, the last technique is sort of what you can see I'm already doing throughout this whole video so far, and that's sort of to use your eraser tool a lot to sort of carve out the line. And the upside to this technique is you get a lot of control over each individual line. You can sort of decide on the thickness of fabric folds, for instance, through the line. So for instance, here you have this sort of swooping line, but if I do this, if I make it thinner at one point, it kind of looks like the fabric is squishing up against itself inside of the folds, and details like that can really enhance like the nature of the drawing, I guess. But the downside to this carving method, that I've called it, is you might end up putting in too many shadows. Like, I sort of have control over this now, but I know earlier I didn't, so I'll just like go into my files and actually find an example of this stuff, because I feel like it's kind of important. So when you're drawing with the carving method, it's really tempting to add these like tiny little shadows everywhere, and those can look nice, but you can also end up overdoing it. And I have two examples of this. So here is one where I added a bunch of shadows everywhere, and I kind of do it because it's a stylistic choice, but I also know I'm doing it to hide some information, such as like I didn't really know what's going on in the neck area, so I just sort of add some shadow to hide it. And I did this a lot back then, because this was probably when I started doing the whole carving method the most, or actually maybe I've always done it, but there are certain aspects to the drawings where I know I added the shadows just because I didn't really know what's going on. And it doesn't look that bad, but it's gonna slow down like your overall improvement. And it can become a lot more obvious than it is in these drawings, such as in this one, where I don't really know what's going on with the wrinkles in this area, but I've kind of hid it, so I'm hoping that people won't think about it. And I have probably the best example of this somewhere around here. Here you go. This is a great example of the problems with the carving method, where I tried to do this foreshortening thing, but I have no idea what's going on here, so I just sort of like make everything into line art, and it doesn't look clean, it doesn't look nice, it's sort of like blobby and weird, and I'm also not allowing myself to make any real mistakes that I can learn from and actually learn how to do foreshortening. So in the entirety of this drawing, I guess it's okay. Maybe people won't think about it, but in the long run you don't want to be doing stuff like this. So you kind of want to mix all of these techniques together to make your piece come together. Like, each method will be useful for sort of different situations. So like the swooping sort of style, I personally love to use with anatomy, like with actual like body parts, because it makes everything look really organic but still clean, and you don't get like these choppy lines on the legs, for instance, where in real life there wouldn't be any choppiness or texture. Whereas with clothing and stuff, you might want to use sort of like more of a build-up line sometimes, and especially with hair. I don't have that much hair on this character yet, but with hair you kind of want to feel out each individual shape, so it might be a good place to use like a mix of the build-up method and the carving method to make sure that the shape is coming across all nicely. Alright, so I'm just gonna move into some sort of like do's and don'ts when it comes to the actual process of doing the line art itself. So the first do, I guess, is to make sure that every single line is always filled with intention. So we don't want any like randomly placed lines. We don't want a line that could have been here, but it could also have been here. I guess this is kind of hard to describe, but like I showed you all this stuff about how to do the line art on this sketch, but the thing is, like, it's very hard for me to show actual intention with each line, because if you see here, the sketch isn't very good. Like, the sketch is so unclear and I haven't made any actual choices, so it's gonna be very hard for me to show any sort of intention in my lines. And you can tell on this arm that each individual direction change in this arm is kind of random, and it's kind of like cowardly, to put it in a dramatic way. But I haven't made any distinct choices. Like, this line kind of moves out to the side, but that's not because I actively thought in my mind like there is a fold here. I just added some texture to like make it look sort of more like clothes. But the reason why I did that is because, as you see here on the sketch, there is no information for me to work with. So when it comes to the line art phase, I'm kind of just like, oh, what do I do? I guess I'll put a line here. I guess I'll make it sort of like wobbly to signify some clothing stuff, and I don't really know that much about clothing folds to begin with, so you kind of get this like vague and insecure sort of line work. So what you want to do before you even start working on your line art is make sure that your sketch is clear and that you can actually read information out of it. Like here, you can see I've drawn like 2 lines signifying the back. Make a choice, make that into one line that you actually want the line to be. And like with the clothing folds, draw out some actual clothing folds. If you're not good at clothing folds, then you should look up some reference or something. Maybe take a picture of yourself from this angle. So you want to just spend a lot of time on your sketch, try to like figure out, how do I want this stuff to be? This isn't coming out so nicely, but I guess I can do it like this. Yeah, sort of make some choices, try to map everything out so that when it comes to the actual drawing stage of the drawing, then you sort of have your work cut out for you and you can just focus on getting the actual lines right. So yeah, I'm just gonna keep cleaning up this sketch, and then I'll come back to you when I feel like the sketch is ready for inking. Okay, so like here on this leg, like first off, the anatomy is kind of messed up, but it's also very unclear where I'm actually planning on having my lines go. And especially on this skirt, there's really nothing to go off on here. And you can see in the finished drawing, I kind of tried to just wing it and come up with some folds at the very end, but it's all very vague and very unclear. And that's because maybe I was too hasty with this drawing. I probably didn't expect this to be like a full finished illustration. I can tell I was kind of going over it fast, but if the sketch was a bit more finished, then I could have probably done some cooler shapes here. So I'll just go back in and do that. Alright, so I feel like I have to make this point now so I don't forget it. But it might look like all I'm doing here is adding details. And that might feel like, you know, oh, so the secret to line art is just drawing details. But that's not the point. The point is that you want to think about the shapes more than you think about the line art. Because even if you have sort of messy line art, if every single line is placed in the right spot, and the lines make out a shape that looks appealing, then the line art is going to come across as more clean. Alright, so I don't feel like I have to clean this up that much more at this point. Like, obviously you're gonna have to leave some stuff out for the actual inking phase. And if it were me, or usually I might have just ended up cleaning this or like carving this until the sketch becomes line art, but for the sake of this video, we'll do the actual line art on top, and we'll see how that turns out. First off, you should always have the sketch somewhere on the side, just somewhere on screen, so that you can tell, like, is my line art looking worse than the sketch? Because that happens a lot, you know, where the sketch is like full of energy and then you start doing the line art and the end result ends up looking worse. So one thing you shouldn't do, and this I feel like really applies for hair, is you shouldn't draw any useless line, and this is kind of the same point I've been making all this time, but you don't want any like throwaway lines that are just kind of there. Like if I draw the hair like this, even if I clean up these lines and every single line is clean, these sort of lines aren't really saying anything more about the hair than if they weren't there. So you should always like try to limit yourself to the lines that are necessary to describe the drawing. And again, this depends on your style. Some people have a style where they go in for like a lot of detail, where they show like every single strand of hair. You can do that if you want to, but I'm assuming you went to this video because you want to see how I think when I draw line art. And I personally like sort of larger shapes. I'm not a huge fan of drawing like really small details on the hair and stuff, because what ends up happening is you end up with a lot of useless lines a lot of the time. So here I've kind of made some mistakes on purpose to get into my next tip, which is you should avoid tapering lines in the wrong place. By that I mean you should be careful with where your line starts and ends. So for instance, these lines sort of start out of nowhere and then go into nowhere, and it ends up kind of ruining the drawing, because like this one is just there without doing anything, but this one is actually messing around with the shape of the drawing, because what this line implies is that this particular shape right here, it gives it a sort of a sausage feel, don't you think? It doesn't feel like that crisp and clean. It doesn't feel like a sharp strand of hair going on top of another strand of hair. And if I were to continue this line art up here, then you can tell like this single line has changed something about what's going on here, about like the three-dimensionality. So I would just remove that and just swap it out with something a bit more helpful, I guess. And this line just sort of tapers into the next line, and this is something I see a lot with sort of beginners, is where you have one shape, but then that shape isn't really connected with itself. And if this was in the middle of the hair, this would be fine, because what this little taper part implies is that the distance between one object and another is getting smaller. So for instance, one strand of hair and another strand of hair is sort of squishing in on itself. I'll draw a butt for you so you can tell what I mean. Here we have a butt. It's drawn with just like the same shape of line art throughout. And what that implies is that this butt cheek and this butt cheek is sort of in front of this leg. Whereas if I taper this line like so, this implies that this piece of meat and this piece of meat is being squished together. And so back to my line art, I guess. What this shape is implying is a large piece of hair in front of a background. There's no like there's nothing here to squish against this piece, so this tapering line becomes a distraction, sort of. It doesn't look, it defeats the sort of three-dimensionality of the drawing. So just make sure to not taper the lines in the wrong place. And a good rule of thumb is like have thinner line on the inside of objects, so such as like if I put a line here, if I put a line here and it's thinner than the rest of the drawing, that's not going to distract anyone because it's part of this larger object that's all got this thick outline. And that, I guess, leads me into my next tip, which is combining your shapes with the line weights. So I actually think if you aren't that good at line art, you shouldn't worry that much about line weight yet. You can try to apply it a bit to your drawing, but don't worry too much about it. But basically, you want your most important shapes to be combined with the thicker line. And you can see I've done this. But yeah, this is the sort of stuff you just want to experiment with, but you want this stuff to sort of come naturally, you know? You don't want to think about it, you just want to be able to see it. And the way you become able to see it is to just be critical. Like really stop drawing and look at your artwork and think like, does this look good? Can I change anything about it to make it look even better? So for instance, here is also a good place to point this out. If I do this, or I guess I can draw a bit more first. Alright, so if the line tapers here, again, this sort of messes up your perception of this entire shape, but if you combine it correctly, then it suddenly looks like it's all the same shape again. And it's gonna be just like a lot more satisfying to look at. And again, like here, I don't really like the way this line looks, so I'll just go ahead and remove the entire thing and try again. It's very important to not be afraid of doing that. I guess the more critical you are of yourself, the faster you're gonna make improvements and improve your skills. So that's basically all the tips I could come up with for now when it comes to line art. There's really no like secret technique to drawing line art. You just kind of have to practice, and unfortunately you also have to improve your actual drawing skills and anatomy skills and visual library and stuff like that, so that your sketch can be filled with intention, and then your finished drawing can also be filled with intention. That's gonna make everything look better. So I guess I can come up with some tips for actually practicing this stuff. So the way I did it is, right when I started to take drawing seriously, I bought myself a really thin pen, like a physical pen, and a really cheap sketchbook. And then I decided I want to be the best at just drawing everything without a sketch and drawing it right the first time. That's gonna be like my art journey, is to master this technique of just like drawing everything out and getting it right the first time. Because Kim Young-gi does it and it works out great for him. He works with a brush pen though. I wanted to be able to do this with like a ballpoint pen. And so I find some pictures online of people sitting around or whatever, and I'll put up a picture of this because I still have the sketchbook. And I just draw. Right now I have Ctrl Z so I can undo my lines, but obviously in a physical sketchbook I didn't have that option, so I just had to like try to get it right the first time. And obviously the drawings are gonna be very wonky if you do this, and stuff is gonna become messed up and the proportions are gonna be messed up. But I feel like it was a really good way to train both my eye and to train my hand, because I'd get used to sort of just like putting down a line and putting faith into that line. The reason why I stopped doing that, I still do it from time to time, but it's not like a goal that I have. But the reason why is because sometimes when you're dealing with really complex shapes, it can be better to use sort of like a pencil and just try to figure everything out and feel it out instead of just like putting down lines and hoping for the best, you know? Alright, so I think that's gonna be it for this video. I really hope you got something out of it, but I would love to get a comment telling me if you found this useful or not, and if there's something else you'd like to see, cause I bought this expensive fucking microphone and I'd love to use it some more so that it wasn't a huge waste of money. And I'll just leave in some footage of me drawing the rest of the line art for this thing. Oh, and one more thing I forgot to mention is obviously you don't want to have tangents. If you don't know what tangents are, they're kind of when two lines merge into each other. Like, I actually have one here, and that's something I gotta fix. Like, this line from what's gonna be the spear thing when I get to it is in the exact same spot as this arm. I was hoping that maybe putting the line like slightly more forward was going to fix this problem, but I can now tell that that's not going to work. So I'm going to have to figure out something to do to avoid that tangent. So I think I figured out the tangent a little bit. Oh fuck. Oh no! Ah, what'd I do? Turn off the sound, I guess. So what I did here is I chose to have the shape language of this line, or I guess just the shape of this line, be very different from the straight line that it's coming into contact with, and making sure that the overlap, even though I have very little space for the overlap, is as clear as possible so that the entirety of the drawing becomes clear and not confusing to look at.